We'd like to welcome you to the National Archives. We're pleased that you could join us for one of our authors' lectures. Before we begin, those of you in the television audience are invited to join us. We're in Washington, D.C. We're located midway between the Capitol and the White House. We have 3 fascinating exhibits on display. You also can see the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights on display 364 days a year. We have a series of films and lectures, and all are free and open to the public. So when you're in town, please take advantage of the opportunity to meet some of the fascinating authors who join us in these programs. Today's guest is participating in our election year series of discussions. Before we listen to the discussion about the culture of contentment, which is our featured book today, we'd like to extend a special thanks to Irene Williams of Houghton Mifflin, which is the publisher of the book, and also to Sue Carlson at Harvard University for her generous help. Briefly, Professor Galbraith could probably be easily described as one of the intellectual titans of the 20th century. You can add to that a man who is known for his charm and his wit. Professor Galbraith is the Paul M. Warburg Professor of Economics Emeritus at Harvard University. His public career has included the Office of Price Controls during World War II. At this point, I would like to digress just a little bit, and this is one of the unique aspects of the National Archives. Yesterday, one of the archivists, I don't see him in the room right now, but his name is Jerry Wallace. He popped into my office with a group of documents. The documents were letters that were prepared by a young lawyer who specialized in tire regulation. This is 1942. The man was about 29 years old. That man who drafted these letters was Richard Nixon. So thank you, Jerry, for digging that up, and you're welcome to come take a look at the letters if anyone would like to see them afterward. On from the Office of Price Administration, Professor Galbraith became an editor of Fortune magazine. He served as ambassador to India, which he told me was one of his most fun jobs, and also a speechwriter and advisor to several presidents of the United States. Professor Galbraith's books are among the most widely read in the history of economics. He is a committed traveler, endlessly curious about the international scene. Professor Galbraith is joining us today to discuss his latest book. He's just come in from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he's going to discuss the culture of contentment. Would you please welcome Professor Galbraith?
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction and for identifying my somewhat distant association with Richard Milhous Nixon. I must tell you of my pleasure in being here in this distinguished series. My pleasure may outdo that of my audience, because it is now getting on to 60 years since I first began university teaching at Harvard, and I am able, in consequence of that, to take any idea, however fragile, and extend it to 55 minutes. And I'm able to take any idea, however complex, obscure, and however needful of explanation, and contract it to 55 minutes. So when I'm finished this morning, unless you're very, very fortunate, you will be wiser, of course, but that is less certain than the fact that you will be a great deal older. The book that I'm called upon to discuss today, The Culture of Contentment, begins with the notion of what an economically mature and developed country such as ours has as its political response. In past times, this was very simple. There were a relatively small number of people, relatively few in number in proportion to the electorate as a whole, who were rich, affluent, in the upper middle class. this was a small number in relation to the larger population of the country. And under those circumstances, several things happened. First, as always, virtue was attributed to good fortune. And now we have a very large number of people who have the comforts, the contentment of a developed economy, and still attribute virtue as did their few predecessors. They still see virtue in the circumstances which give them their good fortune. The number so situated is, I think, not a majority of the population. The statistics do not show that. But it is, I suggest, a majority of those who are likely to vote. And they are the people who have something else in politics, two things else that are important politically. They are the people who have the money in relation to the political process, something that is by no means insignificant. And they have the voice. If one thinks of New York, for example, somebody in downtown New York or some literary figure, well endowed, has a political capacity for political expression that is at least the equal of the voice of all of the people in Harlem and the South Bronx. Below this fortunate group, we have the lower middle class, those who are still in a mood of strong aspiration, and we have a very large group of people no longer mentioned, no longer referred to in the political life of the time, which in this book I refer to as the functional underclass, or just the underclass. As I say, they receive no particular mention in our politics. You have only to reflect on the number of times you hear a reference to the middle class, how rarely you hear a reference to the underclass. And yet these are the people who, by and large, do the unpleasant work of the modern society. They're the people who do the hard, repetitive work in industry. They are the people who harvest our crops, the people who process our food, the people who render a great variety of services, the people who keep the streets clean or moderately dirty. They are the people who do the work that second and third generation Americans do not want to do. This is a constant process that we have in all of the industrial countries of replacing the underclass. This is something that is not peculiar to the United States. The second generation and the third generation moves on, and a new generation of people comes in to do the disagreeable work. This is done in our country by the minorities, particularly those who moved to the northern cities from the south in the last 25, 50 years, those who have come from the West Indies, those who have come from the Orient, and those who have come from deeper in Latin America. And as I say, this is not peculiar to the United States. In Germany, the hard, difficult work is done by the huge Turkish population and the people from Yugoslavia. In Switzerland, similarly, all the hard work is done by migrants from Eastern Europe who come there temporarily, have the nice title of guest worker. France, that work is done by the new invasion of the Moors. This is the common situation, very little mentioned of the modern economy. Our particular problem, however, is that one necessary feature of that whole role of the functional middle class has in recent times that feature has become relatively rare, and that is the upward mobility. To some extent, our middle underclass has been stalled in position, and this in turn has been the basis of the tension in our great cities, the very great tension in our urban centers. We have an underclass that is stalled in a place where in the past there has been upward movement. If I might make a digression to personal history, I was born and brought up on the Canadian side of the Detroit River, where the automobile plants in those days were staffed by young people from the Michigan and Ontario farms. In that part of Ontario, when the autumn came and the leaves fell, there was a general migration for winter work in the automobile plants, the assembly plants, and the body shops in Detroit. I might also, by way of digression, note that this was a democratic process. Having voted in Canada whenever the Canadian elections were held, they voted in Michigan also in the autumn. I remember speaking in a rather fussy way to an old friend of mine, a friend of mine of those days, who told me proudly that he was just back. He was back in Canada for a weekend, that he had just voted, and it was in November. And I said in a rather fussy way, you know, that is not legal. You shouldn't be doing that. And his answer was, if he had lived, he would have voted for Roosevelt. He had voted in a kindly way for some recently deceased Democrat. That generation did not continue in Detroit, and the next migration was from the Appalachian Plateau. This is not something where one can be politically correct. They were everywhere at that time called the poor whites. And the sons of that migration moved out and up, and one had the migration from the deeper south. Detroit became a black city. And I repeat once more, the present process, which is so disturbing, is that this upward movement has, in some considerable measure, become stalled. And therefore, we have a static situation in which we have a majority of the people, or at least a very large minority of the people, who are comfortable, contented, and happy, and a substantial minority which does the work or hopes to find work, and which is what I call the functional underclass. From this comes the basic feature of our political situation at this time. We have one group, the fortunate, the contented, who, among other things, pay the taxes. They are the people who are who's having the income, are the natural source of the revenue on which the country depends, nationally and locally. And we have another group of people, the underclass, which in urban areas, as regards welfare, as regards health care, as regards schooling, 100 other things are the people who need the help. We have one group in our society that pays, we have another group that receives. And from this has come one of the extraordinary features of our time, and that is the attitude toward taxation, a reference to taxation, affecting it does the people who have voice and the people who go to the polls, has become a reference to that in an election. The need for higher taxes has become positively obscene, something which no sensible politician would choose to mention. It cannot be said that we do not want to pay taxes for other people who are less well off than we are. So we invent a certain draping, a draping cover for our dislike for paying taxes. It is said that they are damaging to incentives. When you get, it is said that they are for a useless burden of government. And at the extreme, we have the doctrine that the rich need more money in order that they shall work harder, and the poor need less money in order to make them work. There's a certain agricultural version of that doctrine which I wouldn't dream of using anywhere except in a sophisticated audience in Washington, which is if you feed the horse enough oats, some will pass through to the road for the sparrows. The dominant feature of this is that since one has one group in need of public services, and desperately in our great cities, and another group that pays the taxes, a curious decision, a curious consequence has been the attitude toward government with which so many of you here are identified. Government is a burden in this view, a terrible burden. Except government is not a burden if it is for defense. Nobody talks about the burden of defense. And government is not a burden if it is for paying interest on the public debt. And government is not a burden, not a grave burden, if it's bailing out S&Ls and banks. Government becomes a burden only when it is on behalf of the poor. The case of Social Security, nobody wants ever to say Social Security, so it's called entitlements. That is marginal. But our definition of a burden, of the government as a burden, is associated with the notion that burden is anything that helps the people who are most in need, but we exempt from the notion of burden the rather larger role of government, which in one way or another seems important or is important to the more favored in the community. From this also, this situation, comes a certain political tendency. And that is, since the middle class, the underclass is without voice and without money, and is in some sense outside the political process, our two parties, in a substantial measure, bid for those with money and voice. I think it's fair to say, I'm in a wholly non-political mood today, I think it's fair to say that this bidding for the vote of well-being is taken for granted by one of our great parties, the Republicans. But there is also a strong temptation for the Democratic Party also to make a bid for that same vote, which leaves the underclass without any effective spokesman. A few congressmen, a few senators perhaps, but in general, they are not part of the political process, and they are not, again, to use a word that I have used repeatedly, they are not given a political voice. There's also a strong democratic tradition, a strong tradition of the Democratic Party, which holds that you can only win not by arousing the underclass, not by bringing them to the polls, but by subtracting voters from the Republicans. I go back again to personal history here. A certain part of my life has been spent on campaign planes, working on the next speech. This, as I've sat as my typewriter, has brought me into touch with the current political genius. I don't know whether you are fully aware of what a political genius is in our campaigns, but he is a man, or more rarely a woman, who, having accidentally been on the winning side in the last campaign, is about to lose the next one. And as I've sat at my typewriter on the campaign plane, the political genius moves up to see what I'm writing for the next speech. And I know he's there because over my shoulder comes a great wave of halitosis, spiced in a modest way with alcohol. And as I continue working on, I'm not suggesting anything more than just a certain measure of rejuvenation, nothing serious. And over my shoulder then comes the words, as he sees something I've written, "Professor, you can't say that." The word professor being so cited as to suggest political naivete. "Professor, you can't say that." And I said, well, it's what our candidate believes, it's what the country needs, what the platform calls for. And then comes the great word of the political genius who has mastered, among all things, simple subtraction. He says, if you say that, you will alienate the people who are already most against us. And that has been a strong tendency of our political process in the past, a tendency which has left a very substantial part of our political community outside the political process. This is, I suggest, the basic economic and political situation which characterizes the community of contentment. What will change this? Is it changing in the present election? What invades the process, the political process of contentment? Well, I think there are three things that do. One, looking back over history, a longer view of history, is the peculiar relationship of war to the community of contentment. The fact that any president or any political party which commits itself to war is in the aftermath subject to an adverse reaction of the American people, well, of the English-speaking people. One saw what happened to Wilson after World War I. One saw what happened to Winston Churchill in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and to the Democrats during and after the Korean War, and after the Vietnam War. And one saw what happened to public attitudes in the aftermath of those great exercises in Grenada and Panama. And once again, after the Gulf War. And this is not a matter of economics. It is a matter of politics. It is a matter of anthropology. And it has very deep roots in human motivation and character. When the drums sound in the distant forest, there's an immediate response in tribal rites, a gathering of the forces in response to the drums. But then the drums fade away, the conflict recedes, and there is a powerful anthropological reaction to those who were associated with the previous conflict. And as I say, that has been the fate of politicians ranging from Woodrow Wilson and Winston Churchill on down to President Bush. It's a warning as to what the relationship is of war to the community of contentment. There is also the possibility that the mood of contentment could be brought to an end in our country by the terrible situation in our great cities. Very shortly, a couple of weeks after the book, which I speak of with such admiration today, was published last spring, came the riots and disorder in Los Angeles. And I had predicted in the book, as I'm predicting now, that this was one of the things which could shatter the mood of contentment. I must say I've rarely made a prediction which I so little wanted to see happen in practice. But I think there is also no doubt that those terrible nights in Los Angeles did focus attention on the problem of our central cities and did something at least to impair what had been the mood of contentment. And thirdly, and finally, there is the possibility, and indeed the fact, of recession or depression. If we were having this election next Tuesday, a week from today, under circumstances of high employment, stable prices, generally favorable economic situation, enough growth so people could compare their situation this year with what it was last year or the year before, and not with somebody else who was more fortunate. A very calming situation. We would not be greatly impressed with the campaign of the Democrats. And I don't think we would be greatly impressed, although I am able to control my admiration. I don't think we would be greatly impressed by Ross Perot. But the economy has been now for 2 years and some months in recession. And maybe not so much recession as an underemployment equilibrium. It is basic in economic thought and political thought that the economy functions normally at or near the high levels of employment. There is a distinct and dismal possibility that an economy can find itself in equilibrium in a low level of unemployment. Not a recession, but an enduring situation of poor times. We had that in the 1930s, and after 2 years, we have to raise the possibility that that is the situation at the present time. And it is that recession, that continuing equilibrium of malperformance, that is making this election a close race, and which has and which has done so because it has invaded the mood of contentment that we experienced in the 1980s and before. Well, that covers the circumstances that I deal with in this book. And having heard this, I hate to have my publisher know this, but your act of purchase will be, of course, a goodwill gesture, but you will have, on reading it, you will discover the extent to which, in a mere half hour, you have got the essence of this notable book. Let me say, going on beyond the book, just one word about the economic situation. As I say, we must assume that we have a continuing situation here that may not have within itself the capacity for revival. And therefore, the need, whoever wins this election, is going to be for strongly positive action to break us out of this equilibrium of low performance. It is not going to come about simply by prayer. And it is not going to come out even by more predictions of recovery from the White House. In the 1930s, after there were predictions by President Hoover that the Depression was over, the stock market always took a bad drop because it was held that if things were getting better, he wouldn't be under some compulsion to say they were getting better or going to get better. That only a favorable prediction meant bad news. I think we have to some extent reached that point at the present time. And the nature of the positive action that is required must, in my view, be based not on theory, not on some improbable connection between action and effect, but on something which one knows has a solid positive effect on the economy. And I don't think that one can escape from the central line of action which serves that end, and that is to put people to work on a great range of needed public or subsidized investment. Our roads are in poor condition, our bridges are crumbling, our airports are overworked, our railroad system is in bad disrepair, our school buildings are shabby, we have an enormously inadequate housing stock, and I see no alternative if we were going to escape from this underemployment equilibrium that we put people to work in a very substantial fashion on these needs, on creating wealth that is not created when people are unemployed or when plant and machinery is not working. The Japanese have recently announced such a program. I'm told that by my Canadian colleagues that it is now, one is now under consideration by a relatively conservative government in Canada. Something in limited form has been proposed by Governor Clinton. I would like to see a really solid, substantial effort in this regard. You will say that must increase the deficit. I think that is true, and I think we must put the deficit aside for the time being. It was one of our sad errors that we ran a large deficit in the public accounts in the 1980s when we didn't need to. We must now, when we need to, accept the fact that this must be a time of heavy government investment in making jobs and in creating wealth. Then when things improve, we must prove that we are a disciplined people and not reduce taxes, not increase spending, but reduce the deficit. We must recognize there is one policy for recession or depression, and there is another policy for good times. This requires discipline, intelligence, energy, and an energized attitude toward the economy, and this is what we must show in the future we can do. There are all alternatives to increasing the deficit, which would be useful. I would be very much like to see a very substantial reduction in arms expenditure, particularly for exotic weapons. That's a very inefficient way to employ people. And the Germans and Japanese have shown that having those people available, the engineers and the scientists that are involved, available for civilian goods, is a source of the economic strength which they have gained and which we in some measure have lost. As I say, this does not lead me in any way to suggest anything as regards your political position which I would urge upon you. I want you to know that nothing would cause me more pain and grief than the thought that I was coming to the District of Columbia and making a political speech before a strictly non-political audience. I must say that, again, my pleasure in being here, my appreciation of you as an audience. You've given every indication of attention. Contrast with what I would expect to our home in Cambridge when after something going on to 3/4 of an hour, everybody would be giving indication of wanting to be somewhere else. Once again, it is so clear that a prophet is with honor whenever he is some distance from home. Thank you.
We'll be happy to take questions from the audience. Please use the microphone.
What effect will the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada have on our employment situation?
Oh, don't bother about that too much. The trade agreement will have some beneficial effect in Mexico, where factories will be in search of low-wage jobs, but it will have some effect here in the technology, high design, and so forth, for which Mexico will be a better market. We get an enormous excitement over these trade agreements. And we always see great things happening in the future, and we never look back and see how little has changed. I've often said in my years as a Harvard professor that one wants rather dull people to teach international trade, because one wants people who can get excited about what is going to happen and never notice how little has happened.
Advising the presidential aspirants about how to deal with the problem of international competitiveness, what advice would you provide?
Well, my first advice would be to get somebody who can develop enthusiasm for that subject, which I can't. I would urge that the problem of the trade deficit it will only be solved by, first of all, a good working domestic economy. And it will be partially solved by the kind of economic action which I just mentioned. A good working American economy is one where our capital goods industries are functioning, and where the functioning, their saleable surplus is available for export. Not surplus, but their going production. But my own advice would be overwhelmingly to concentrate on domestic issues, on the assumption that the trade deficit is not the central or vital factor with which should be concerned. Nothing is more important in politics than political policy than understanding what should be emphasized and what should be left to, well, amiable people who don't quite know what they're doing.
What kind of interaction do you foresee between the underclass and those that you consider contented?
I'm not quite sure I got the point. State it again.
I'm asking, what kind of future interaction do you foresee between the underclass and the contented classes?
Oh, I want to see the underclass brought abreast of the basic well-being that is necessary for political tranquility and political stability. I don't have any great hope for equality. I do think we have an egregiously bad distribution of income at the present time, and I certainly applaud the proposals that are being made to raise taxes on the rich. But the more important thing is that we bring to the support of the underclass the public services, and they are public services, and there's no evading the cost, which will, on housing, on welfare, on medical care, on drug counseling, which is extremely important, and then particularly on our educational facilities and schools, and giving teachers, again, the prestige of good pay. There's nothing else that is a greater source of prestige that brings the underclass into the process of upward movement. I could easily be repeating my lecture, but I think you now have got the.
If they're not brought in, though, what do you see as the consequences?
I didn't get that question. Follow-up questions are always much worse than the original one. I'll pass it by.
If they're not brought in, a program like you're suggesting, I mean, do you foresee more violence, more?
Oh, absolutely not. Let us be clear on one thing: that violence is associated with poverty and hopelessness. We don't have poverty in the affluent suburbs. We don't have violence in the affluent suburbs. We don't have violence in the parts of the country of relative well-being. There is an intimate, inescapable association between violence and civil disorder, between poverty and civil disorder. I must say that I came very close there to George Bush's mixing up of reception and recession, didn't I?
Sir. Senator Paul Tsongas, among others, have stated that in the future economic stresses might occur in the growing large numbers of older Americans and a smaller younger generation to follow up behind them. Could you comment on the possibility of that at all?
Say that again, I didn't get it.
Senator Tsongas and several others have spoken about the future stresses coming up in our economic relationship between a growing number, large number of older Americans and a smaller number of younger Americans. Do you foresee
I think
that?
this is all good. Today, because there's a superb example of how older Americans speak with a final and superior relationship to truth. I just a week ago celebrated my 84th birthday with a burst of new intelligence.
How could the work in the ecological changes that are necessary with the economy?
I'm not sure I got that, so repeat it once more.
How could we work in the ecological changes that are necessary with the economy?
Oh, I've just been lecturing on that this past week. I do not see any conflict between a strong economy and the necessary environmental, ecological restraints that are required. This is not something that is going to be done by, again, by wishful thought. It is something which requires an intelligent structure of regulation, absolutely essential. But I don't think there's any conflict between that and a good working economy. If there are those who argue that we can only be competitive if we have unlimited pollution, they should be consigned to live with the pollution in some rather confined space.
Do you think the decline in labor union membership is going to continue, or do you think there's any possibility of a revitalized labor movement?
This is a larger subject. To some extent, I've also been lecturing on this, writing about it. To some extent, the decline of the trade union movement is part of a larger economic process by which the kind of enterprises, the kind of economic structures, the kind of industry that was very important to the trade unions moves on in an ineluctable fashion to the newer countries. In the last century, textile manufacturing, steel, so forth, moved out of Britain to France, and particularly to Germany and the United States. Those were industries where trade unions which were the natural object of trade union success. And they moved then from the United States to Japan. And they've now moved, those industries are now moving from Japan on to the other countries of the Pacific Basin. And as they have moved away from the United States in this great process, the trade unions have certainly been weakened because these are the industries which have a natural affinity for the union, a natural purpose for the union. They, after the heavy industry goes, there are the services, much less open to union action. There's the emphasis on design and higher technology. We're not left bereft by this process. Those are not good areas of trade union operation and development. After things work well and after things look well, people go on to entertainment, as we have. And entertainment is not a natural area of trade union development, though it's something that's becoming very important in our economy. I mean, no other country can compete with us, for example, in producing morally depraved television programs. So that I see the decline of the trade union as to some extent inevitable and to some extent irreversible.
Sir, do you think then that America's future in heavy industry is non-existent?
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say non-existent, but we are subject to this process which I've just identified One of the extraordinary things is the extent to which Japan is now being subject to that. As industries move on to Korea and Taiwan and to Thailand and Malaysia. My wife and I were in Japan a couple of years ago in Nagasaki for quite a different matter, but we took a tour around the Nagasaki harbor. And the great Mitsubishi shipbuilding plants stretch for a mile there. Shipbuilding and ship repair, all idle, all moved on in this process to Korea, Taiwan. So that I don't think that we will ever see the American economy again centered on the steel industry the way it was in the 19th century and early part of this century. I must say, you should have to, again, an area of reminiscence. I come here to the National Archives as with the greatest of pleasure, because the archives have, apart from letters written for me by Richard Nixon, one of the world's largest collections of letters condemning Galbraith for the prices he was setting. And in those days, I spent all of my mornings with the great executives of the old line companies. And I formulated what I hoped would, for the rest of my rest of time, be known as Galbraith's first law of executive intelligence, which is the great industrial executive comes to resemble very closely, intellectually, the product he manufactures. Until in those days you spent a whole morning with Benjamin Ferris, the head of U.S. Steel, you never had a full appreciation of the intellectual nature of a billet of steel. And you went on to that. The oil men, of whom we saw a great deal, were rather smooth, a bit slippery. The hard coal men, of which the anthracite people, which were still important in those days, had some resemblance to a very large chunk of coal. And I don't remember dealing with IBM in those days, but I would have imagined that if I had, there would have been some indication of an artificial intelligence. As I say, this was Galbraith's first law of executive intelligence, and it never took hold, I'm sorry. One more. See, you have to understand that a lecture is essentially an authoritarian device. You listen to the lecture, and then you have a few questions in order to give it a wholly fraudulent aspect of democracy. Are there any more questions? Pass it in.
You say you've been able to contain your enthusiasm for Ross Perot. Do you think his economic flip charts add up, or do you think he's just praying to a recession audience and he really doesn't have any concept of whether he can work within the government like the politicians Clinton and Bush?
You put the matter very well.
Have you seen his flip chart?
We've always had these people in American politics. They've run over the years from Huey Long, Father Townsend, George Wallace. We can always count on somebody in every election, every period of time, being slightly around the bend. And that, I'm forced to say, is where a diligent person will search and find Ross Perot.
Did you want to take any more questions?
Pardon?
Did you want to take any more questions?
I think I've covered all the subject matter.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Galbraith, for joining us today. We'd like to invite you all, I know you're sad that this hour is coming to a close. We'd like to invite you to join us up here at the stage over by the table for the book signing. The books are available outside for sale. And once again, the book is The Culture of Contentment. Those of you in the television audience can purchase the book at your local bookstores.